On January 3rd, 2026, at exactly 2:01 in the morning, a fleet of U.S. military helicopters touched down in Caracas, Venezuela. 30 minutes later, Nicolás Maduro was in custody. And just like that, the United States had seized control of what amounts to $17.3 trillion in proven oil reserves. The operation was swift. It was decisive. And if you're watching the news, you probably think this was about democracy, about freedom, about standing up to a dictator. But what if I told you this operation had almost nothing to do with Venezuela, and everything to do with a pattern that has been destroying empires for over 2,000 years? A pattern so consistent, so predictable, that you can almost set your watch to it. Right now, as you're watching this, the United States national debt stands at $38.5 trillion. That number is growing by $6.12 billion every single day. Interest payments alone have crossed $1 trillion a year, and in 2025, 142,000 millionaires packed their bags and left the world's traditional wealth centers. That number is expected to climb to 165,000 in 2026. Now here's the thing that should send a chill down your spine. That raid on Venezuela? It wasn't a sign of strength, it was stage 4 of a 7-stage cycle. The same cycle that destroyed the Roman denarius, the same cycle that toppled the Dutch guilder, the same cycle that dethroned the British pound. Every single dominant empire and reserve currency in recorded history has followed this identical path. And right now, the United States is deep into it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what stage we're in, what comes next, and what the greatest wealth transfer in modern history is going to look like. More importantly, you're going to know what you can actually do about it. Because the people who see this coming don't just survive. They come out the other side wealthier than they went in. So let's start with the pattern itself, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Over the last 2,000 years, every dominant empire has followed the same 7-stage life cycle. Rome in 265 AD, the Dutch Republic in 1780, the British Empire in 1931, and now the United States in 2026. The dates change, the currencies change, the geography changes, but the stages never do. Stage 1 is always the same. It starts with sound money. The empire establishes a currency that's backed by something real, usually gold or silver. Because the money is trustworthy, trade flows in. Other nations want to do business with you because they know your currency holds its value. Wealth builds naturally through productivity, through innovation, through genuine economic output. This is the golden age. The foundation is solid, and everything built on top of it is real. Stage 2 is where that wealth gets put to work. The empire looks around at all this prosperity and starts funding big social programs. Infrastructure goes up. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, highways. Healthcare systems expand. Education becomes widely available. The middle class grows, living standards rise, and on the surface, everything looks like progress. But there's a subtle shift happening underneath. Spending begins to move from creation to maintenance. Instead of building new wealth, the empire starts spending just to keep what it already has running. The trajectory changes, but almost nobody notices because life still feels good. Stage 3 is when the cracks appear, military costs start climbing, the empire has commitments all over the world, and those commitments are expensive. But the revenue isn't growing fast enough to keep up, so the empire does what every empire eventually does. It starts debasing its currency. In ancient times, that meant literally shaving the edges off coins or mixing in cheaper metals. Today, it means printing money. The effect is the same. Inflation begins to creep in. The purchasing power of ordinary people starts to erode. And slowly, trust in the currency begins to weaken. Stage 4 is where desperation enters the picture. The empire realizes that its currency is losing credibility, so it pivots to grabbing hard assets. Oil, minerals, land, strategic resources. This is where military operations stop being about ideology and start being about survival. The empire needs real, tangible wealth to prop up a system that's running on fumes. And that raid on Venezuela on January 3rd, that is a textbook stage 4 move. 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, valued at roughly $17.3 trillion. That's not a foreign policy decision. That's a lifeline. Stage 5 is the loss of confidence. This is when inflation starts hitting people where they live. Grocery bills go up. Rent goes up. The gap between the wealthy and everyone else stretches wider and wider. Capital starts fleeing. Smart money, institutional money, sovereign wealth funds, they all start quietly diversifying away from the dominant currency. Foreign nations that once held the currency in reserve start looking for alternatives. The exit is slow at first, then it accelerates. Stage 6 is what economists call fiscal dominance. This is the point of no return. Debt interest payments start consuming so much of the government's revenue that there's almost nothing left for anything else. The central bank is trapped. If it raises interest rates to fight inflation, the debt becomes even more expensive to service. If it prints more money to cover the debt, inflation gets worse. There is no good option. There is no painless exit. The math simply doesn't work anymore. And on January 5th, 2026, former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen issued a warning that used exactly this term, fiscal dominance. That's not a talking head on social media. That's the person who ran the Treasury Department telling you the trap is closing. Stage 7 is the collapse and reset. This is hyperinflation, default, or both. The currency loses most or all of its purchasing power. And here's the critical part. Wealth doesn't disappear during a collapse. It transfers. It moves from the people holding the currency to the people holding hard assets. Every single time, without exception. The people who saw it coming and positioned themselves in gold, in land, in real resources, they come out the other side with their wealth intact or multiplied. Everyone else watches their savings evaporate. Now, if you're thinking this sounds dramatic, let me walk you through exactly how this played out in history. Because this isn't theory. This is documented, verified, happened in the real world history. Let's start with Rome. In 64 AD, at the height of the empire, the Roman denarius was 94% pure silver. It was the most trusted currency in the known world. Trade flowed through Rome because everyone knew the denarius was reliable. But as the empire expanded, costs exploded. More soldiers needed to be paid, more borders needed to be defended. More citizens demanded bread and circuses. So the emperors started debasing the coin, a little at first, then a lot. By 265 AD, that same denarius contained just 0.5% silver. It was a coin in name only. The result was catastrophic. Prices rose by 1,000%. Hyperinflation ravaged the economy. The government tried everything. Higher taxes, forced price controls, paying soldiers more just to keep them from deserting. None of it worked because none of it addressed the fundamental problem. The money wasn't real anymore. Trade collapsed. The economy fragmented. The only people who made it through were the ones who held land and gold, physical, tangible assets that didn't depend on anyone's promise. The empire officially ended in 476 AD, but the economic death happened long before that. Now let's look at the Dutch Republic. Most people don't realize this, but the Dutch guilder was the first modern reserve currency. The Netherlands in the 1600s was the economic center of the world. The Dutch East India Company was the most valuable corporation in human history, worth the equivalent of roughly $7.9 trillion in today's money. The Dutch had the best ships, the best financial systems, the best trade networks. They were unstoppable until they weren't. Overextension did them in. Too many colonies, too many wars, too much debt. Internal political fighting made everything worse. And then the Anglo-Dutch War from 1780 to 1784 delivered the knockout blow. The war bankrupted the Republic, the guilder collapsed, and the wealth that had been concentrated in the Netherlands flowed to the next rising power. Britain, same pattern, same stages, same outcome. And then there's the British Empire. The pound sterling was the world's dominant currency for over 200 years. At its peak, Britain controlled a quarter of the Earth's land surface. The sun literally never set on the British Empire. But World War I changed everything. The war was enormously expensive, and Britain financed much of it by borrowing from the United States. World War II made it worse. By the end of both wars, Britain was deeply in debt to America. In 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound was no longer backed by anything tangible. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement officially shifted global financial power to the US dollar. And in 1967, Britain was forced to devalue the pound. The whole process of dethroning took about 20 years. It wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a slow, grinding erosion. and the wealth that had been stored in pounds transferred to dollars and hard assets. The people who saw it coming repositioned. The people who didn't lost everything they had built over generations. So now let's apply this framework to the United States, stage by stage. Because when you line it up, the parallels are not just similar, they're almost identical. Stage 1. The United States' sound money era began in 1944 with the Bretton Woods Agreement. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. At the time, America held roughly 2/3 of the world's gold supply. Every other major currency was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. This was the foundation. It was solid, it was real, and it made the dollar the most trusted currency on the planet. Stage 2 came in the post-World War II era. America built the most comprehensive welfare state the world had ever seen. Social Security expanded, the interstate highway system was constructed, education spending soared, manufacturing boomed. The middle class exploded in size and prosperity. This was the American dream in its purest form, funded by the genuine economic output and growth that came from having the world's reserve currency. Life was good, and the spending felt sustainable because it was being paid for by real productivity. Stage 3 arrived with Vietnam and the Cold War. Military spending spiraled upward. The U.S. had commitments on every continent, bases in dozens of countries, and 2 massive ideological conflicts to fund. The bills piled up faster than tax revenue could cover them. And on August 15, 1971, President Nixon made one of the most consequential economic decisions in modern history. He closed the gold window. The dollar was no longer convertible to gold. Just like that, American money went from being backed by something real to being backed by nothing but trust. A fiat currency, the 1970s brought immediate consequences. Inflation surged, the dollar's purchasing power dropped visibly. To buy time, the U.S. struck a deal with Saudi Arabia in 1974, creating the petrodollar system. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in dollars, and in return the U.S. would provide military protection. This was brilliant. It created artificial global demand for dollars. Every country that wanted to buy oil, which was every country, needed dollars to do it. But here's the key. The petrodollar didn't fix the underlying problem. It delayed it. It bought time. Decades of time, in fact. But the fundamental math hadn't changed. Spending still exceeded revenue. The currency was still unbacked. The clock was still ticking. Stage 4 is where we are right now, and this is where the Venezuela operation fits in perfectly. Look at the pattern. Iraq in 2003. The official reason was weapons of mass destruction. The strategic result was control over one of the world's largest oil reserves. Libya in 2011. The official reason was humanitarian intervention. Muammar Gaddafi was reportedly planning a gold-backed African currency that would have directly challenged the dollar. Within months he was gone, and Libya's oil and gold reserves were accessible. Syria, a strategic positioning play in one of the most resource-rich and geopolitically critical regions on the planet. And now, Venezuela, January 3rd, 2026. Operation Absolute Resolve. President Trump publicly stated that U.S. oil firms would be coming in to fix Venezuela's crumbling infrastructure. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. Venezuela's oil industry has been mismanaged for years, but let's look at the numbers honestly. Developing Venezuela's reserves would require an estimated $180 billion over 15 years. And even then, it would represent less than 1% of global oil supply. This is not a strategic energy play that changes America's position in the world. This is a stage 4 move, an empire reaching for hard assets because its currency alone can no longer sustain the system. It's a temporary patch on a structural problem. Every empire does this, and it never works long term, because the underlying issue isn't a lack of resources. It's that the money itself is broken. Stage 5 is already manifesting around us, and the numbers tell the story clearly. In 2025, 142,000 millionaires migrated away from traditional wealth centers. In 2026, that number is projected to hit 165,000. These aren't random people. These are high net worth individuals with access to the best financial advice in the world, and they're moving. The United Kingdom is hemorrhaging wealthy residents. China and India are losing them too. Where are they going? The UAE, Singapore. Countries with low taxes, stable governance, and favorable conditions for wealth preservation. And then there's the reserve currency data. In the year 2000, the US dollar made up 71% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2023, that number had fallen to 59%. That's a 12-point drop in just over 2 decades. And the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their expanding membership are actively working to create alternative trading systems that don't depend on the dollar at all. None of this is happening in secret. It's all out in the open. The confidence is eroding, slowly, steadily, and measurably. Stage 6 is the one that should genuinely concern you, because the math here is inescapable. The national debt is $38.5 trillion and growing by $6.12 billion every single day. Interest payments on that debt have already crossed $1 trillion a year. Think about that. More than $1 trillion spent every year just on interest, not paying down the debt, not funding schools or hospitals or roads, just servicing the interest on money already spent. And projections show that by 2035, annual interest payments could reach $18 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio is projected to hit somewhere between 156 and 220%. At those levels, the debt isn't just a problem, it's the only problem. Everything else becomes secondary because the central bank is stuck in an impossible position. Raise rates to control inflation, and the interest payments on the debt explode even further. Lower rates or print money to manage the debt, and inflation spirals out of control. There is no door number 3. When Janet Yellen warned about fiscal dominance on January 5, 2026, she was describing exactly this trap, the point where monetary policy becomes entirely subordinate to the government's need to finance its debt. That's not a warning about something that might happen someday, that's a description of what's already happening. Stage 7 hasn't fully arrived yet for the United States, but based on every historical precedent, once fiscal dominance takes hold, the timeline to hyperinflation, or default, is typically between 5 and 25 years. The exact timing depends on how aggressively the government prints money, how quickly global confidence erodes, and whether any external shocks accelerate the process. But the destination has never changed, not once in 2,000 years. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, and these objections deserve honest answers. The first one is, this time is different. People say that every single time, and they always have what sounds like a good reason. Rome had concrete and engineering that was centuries ahead of its time. Britain had the Industrial Revolution. America has Silicon Valley and artificial intelligence. And yes, technology is incredible. It drives productivity, it creates wealth, but technology has never once in history solved the fundamental problem of a government spending more than it earns. The math required to grow out of this debt would demand sustained GDP growth of somewhere between 5 and 20% per year. That hasn't happened in any developed economy in modern history. Technology doesn't change the arithmetic of debt. It just makes the decline more comfortable for a while. The second objection is reserve currency status. People say the dollar can't fail because it's the world's reserve currency. And they're right that reserve currency status provides enormous advantages. But the British pound was the world's reserve currency for over 200 years, and it's still failed. Reserve status doesn't prevent the cycle. It extends it. It gives you more rope. But if you keep spending, eventually you reach the end of that rope. The third objection is the most common one. The government can just print more money. And technically, yes, the government can print as much money as it wants. There's no physical limit. But there's an economic limit, and it's called hyperinflation. Weimar Germany printed money. Zimbabwe printed money, Venezuela printed money. In every single case, the result was the same. The currency became worthless. Printing money doesn't create wealth, it redistributes it. Specifically, it transfers wealth from the people holding the currency to the people doing the printing and the people holding real assets. That's not a solution. That's the mechanism of collapse. So the real question becomes, what do you actually do with this information? Because understanding the pattern is only useful if you act on it. And here's what has worked in every single historical transition. First, hold hard assets: gold, silver, land, real resources. These are the things that have survived every currency collapse in recorded history. When the Roman denarius became worthless, gold still bought you food. When the guilder collapsed, land still had value. When the pound was dethroned, People holding precious metals and real estate preserved their wealth. Hard assets are not speculative bets. They are the historical baseline of wealth preservation. Second, acquire skills that are indispensable regardless of what happens to the economy. Healthcare, engineering, skilled trades, plumbing, electrical work, construction. These skills have value in any economic environment because they solve real, tangible problems that people will always pay to have solved. When currencies fail, the people who can do things that others need done are the ones who thrive. Third, build optionality into your life. This means having the ability to relocate if necessary. It means having accounts in foreign jurisdictions, not to evade taxes, but to ensure you have access to your wealth if capital controls are imposed. And capital controls have been imposed in almost every currency crisis in history. It means building networks and relationships in multiple places so you're not entirely dependent on a single system. Fourth, diversify your currency exposure. Holding all of your wealth in a single currency is a concentration risk, and the historical track record of fiat currencies is not encouraging. Consider holding some portion in other currencies, the Chinese yuan, the Swiss franc, or currencies that have some form of commodity backing. This isn't about betting against the dollar, it's about not betting everything on it. And fifth, and this might be the most important one, avoid the trap of inaction. The single biggest risk in any currency transition is normalcy bias, the deeply human belief that because things have been a certain way for your entire life, they will continue to be that way forever. Every generation that lived through a currency collapse had people who said it couldn't happen, who said the signs were overblown, who said there was still plenty of time. History doesn't care what you believe, it does what it does. So let's talk about what the timeline likely looks like from here, and let's tie it back to Venezuela, because that event is more significant than most people realize. The Venezuela raid is a stage 4 symptom. It's the action of an empire that needs hard assets to prop up a system that's losing structural integrity. It's not a sign of strength, it's a sign of desperation dressed up as strength. And if history is any guide, this is what comes next. Over the next 2 to 5 years, expect accelerating wealth migration. More millionaires and billionaires relocating to jurisdictions they view as safer. Expect inflation to remain stubbornly persistent, regardless of what central banks do with interest rates. Expect geopolitical tensions to increase as competing powers sense the shift and position themselves accordingly. Over the next 5 to 10 years, expect meaningful erosion in the dollar's global role. More bilateral trade agreements that bypass the dollar entirely. The possibility of capital controls or restrictions on moving money out of the country. And a debt crisis that moves from the financial pages to the front page. Over the next 10 to 25 years, expect the reset. The full transfer of wealth from those holding the old system's currency to those holding the assets that underpin the new one. The specific form this takes, whether it's hyperinflation, a negotiated restructuring, a new monetary system, or some combination, is impossible to predict precisely. But the direction is not. It's the same direction it has gone every single time for 2,000 years. And I want to be very clear about something. This is not a forecast based on opinion. This is a pattern based on historical precedent. Every data point I've shared with you is verifiable. Every historical example played out exactly as described. The only variable is timing, and even the timing follows a recognizable range. The pattern is absolute. The United States is currently in stage 4, actively entering stage 5, and stage 6 is already manifesting in the debt and interest payment data. Every empire that reached this point continued through to stage 7. There are no exceptions. The only choice you have is whether to position yourself on the right side of the transfer or to ignore the pattern and hope this is the first time in 2,000 years that the outcome is different. If this video opened your eyes, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. The next video is going to go deep on the specific indicators of stages 5 and 6 as they unfold in real time, and I'm going to reveal the top 3 asset classes that have historically outperformed during every collapse in the cycle. The window to position yourself is closing, and the people who move first always come out ahead.